Welcome, everyone, to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm John Macri, and joining me, as always, Nate, the great Jahnke. Nate, this is it. We're 8 days away from kickoff week 1. Ravens, Chiefs, roster cutdowns are in as well. Still going to be some roster moves leading up to kickoff, I'm sure. But I'd say this feels like a pretty good time to do a full 2024 season preview. What do you say?
Yeah, I think it's about that time. On one hand, I'm excited for the season to start. On the other hand, I'm sad for draft season to be ending. Have multiple drafts going on right now, still have some more drafts to go. And then once we get to the start of the season, we won't get to do drafts again until next year.
I know. That's it's always the most fun part of the off season, right? And yeah, luckily we got so many drafts that we can do. I know some people only have like one draft, and a lot of them are going to be this weekend coming up. So I love drafting. I love the off season and kind of guessing of what's going to happen and prognosticating about all these players and everything like that. But the actual action is going to happen starting next week, and with all these drafts potentially happening this weekend, we know it's a big draft weekend. We're hopefully going to be able to provide some more insight heading into the season to help people get ready for those final fantasy drafts. But yeah, this will be fun. We're going to go round by round. We're going to discuss kind of our strategies, maybe favorite and least favorite targets, and whatever else comes to mind with the many fantasy options being drafted right now. We're going to look at probably the first 10 rounds of drafts. So at least 120 names will be dropped in this episode, not necessarily going into detail on every single one, but at least providing kind of our general feelings on which ones are most interesting to us in order to help you all get ready for the 2024 fantasy season. Like I said, there are going to be a ton of fantasy drafts this weekend, so hopefully we're able to help you get ready for those drafts in any way, shape, or form. But before we do, I want to give a quick shout out to one of our sponsors, DraftKings. We had the appetizer last week. Now it's time to feast. College football is back. Don't miss any of the action. Jump in at DraftKings Sportsbook. It's a full slate of games for week 1, including the big matchup in Atlanta between the preseason number 1 and number 16. Number 1 place to bet touchdowns. DraftKings currently has the most touchdown markets offered and leads in touchdown futures and season specials. Touchdowns can be scored on the ground, through the air, or a defensive effort. Any of those methods can result in a winning bet. This is going to be DraftKings' biggest college football season to date. Enjoy the ride now all the way through the expanded playoffs, plus all newbies getting into the college spirit. Here's something extra special. New DraftKings customers can bet $5 to get $200 in bonus bets instantly. Score big with DraftKings all college football season long. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now and use code PFF. That's code PFF for new customers get $200 in bonus bets when you bet just $5 only on DraftKings. The crown is yours. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In New York, call 877-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369. In Connecticut, help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-78 97777 or visit ccpg.org. Please play responsibly on behalf of Boot Hill Casino and Resort in Kansas. 21 plus age and eligibility varies by jurisdiction. Void in Ontario. Bonus bets expire 168 hours after issuance. For additional terms and responsible gaming resources, see dkng.co/ftball. All right, Nate, here we go. We're entering our draft. It's round 1. We're looking at the sleeper ADP. This is what we see. Starting at the 101, running back Christian McCaffrey of the San Francisco 49ers, followed by Tyreek Hill, wide receiver for the Miami Dolphins, wide receiver CeeDee Lamb for the Dallas Cowboys, wide receiver Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings, wide receiver Jamar Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals, running back Bijan Robinson of the Atlanta Falcons, wide receiver Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions, running back Breece Hall of the New York Jets, wide receiver A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles, wide receiver Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets, running back Saquon Barkley of the Philadelphia Eagles, and running back Jahmyr Gibbs of the Detroit Lions. Those are the first 12 picks on Sleeper. Obviously, these are kind of our best bets for like top 5 upside, almost, regardless of where you're picking from. So we're probably going to be pretty satisfied with any of these guys at the top of our drafts, but anyone in particular who you are maybe potentially concerned about or tend to pass on for one of the other round 1 guys more often than not?
Yeah, I'd say I find myself not drafting too much of Bijan Robinson or Breece Hall. A lot of it just is the risk compared to the wide receivers in this range. Compared to a guy like Amon-Ra St. Brown, we know exactly who he is. We know what he's capable of doing. It would basically only take an injury to stop him from seeing the production that we've been seeing. Like, yeah, maybe Jamison Williams has an excellent season and that cuts into his target share a little bit, but he's still going to be a must-start player every single week. And like the biggest risk is just injury there, where for the running backs, it's like, what if they end up liking Tyler Algier a little bit more in some situations? That very well could happen. Algier is graded better as both a runner and a passer these past 2 years, and Algier is a very good player, so that could very well happen. And then Breece Hall, a little bit concerned about his target share. Like, he was excellent as a receiver last year, and now getting Aaron Rodgers. Rodgers likes throwing the ball downfield. I'm sure they'll have some plays specifically designed for Hall, but I'm worried about his target share just decreasing because he's not going to get dumped off to as often as he was in the Jets offense before. So I feel a lot more comfortable, especially in these middle parts of the first round, getting one of these wide receivers that we know is an excellent player and we know is going to be on the field all the time and lead their team in targets and so on, versus one of these running backs where I do think there is still risk in them, even though I agree that they are the second and third best running back options out of all of them out there.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And for me, yeah, I guess I kind of have similar concerns, at least with one of the wide receivers, and it being with the Jets as well. Like Garrett Wilson is, I've found at least has been one of the ones that I've kind of tended to go away from a little bit more. Like, we know he's obviously incredibly talented. There's likely a lot of like untapped potential there in terms of his fantasy upside, which is why he's a first round pick. But at the same time, we know that he's also very quarterback dependent to return on that investment, right? Which, all wide receivers are to an extent. But for a first round pick and knowing how much he can be held back, he didn't crack the top 20 PPR wide receivers these past 2 years, with a lot of Zach Wilson at quarterback, had just 4 top 10 PPR weekly finishes across his 34 games played since 2022, and only one of those came in 2023. Last year, he also had the worst total in fantasy points below expected at minus 65.2, was fourth worst in that regard in 2022. And it's almost entirely due to quarterback play, right? Like, now Aaron Rodgers should be the upgrade that we're all expecting. There's no doubt about that. But it's still kind of a lot to hang on a 40-year-old quarterback coming off an Achilles injury, right? So, it helps a bit that Tyrod Taylor is the QB2 there, but it's still not like ideal. And to me, there's definitely risk there. So if Rodgers returns to form, allows Garrett Wilson to even perform like as expected from, given his usage these past 2 seasons, then we're looking at that potentially top 10, even higher upside. But the risk is undeniable, in my opinion, especially in round 1. So, all these guys are great bets, but that's, I guess, if I'm looking at like one player that I'm kind of lower on or avoiding in this round, or at least I found myself tending to do in these drafts, it's probably been Garrett Wilson.
Yeah, with Wilson, like, there's a couple of guys where we are depending on a huge quarterback improvement that we don't see any other time, really. Like, we see teams draft rookie quarterbacks and we're not expecting a lot of rookies in year 1. We rarely ever see a huge improvement in quarterback play for a team from one year to the next. And we see that with both the Jets this year and the Falcons, the 2 worst teams at quarterback play over the past 2 years, getting a veteran who has been consistently good over several years. So with Wilson, as well as receivers for the Falcons, it's a big projection because we just don't have these like past data points to look at and say, see, we've seen this huge improvement by wide receivers before, because we never see this improvement from quarterbacks before.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to kind of bank on for sure. But yeah, like how about for, as far as like round 1 goes and like starting points in fantasy drafts, do you have like a favorite draft range, like slot like 1 to 3, or, the middle rounds or the end of the first round, anything like that, where you find yourself utilizing like a specific type of strategy to kind of go through the rest of your drafts, or are you just willing to, soak up the value as it drops to you from whatever draft position?
Yeah, like particularly 12-team leagues, I like drafting early in the drafts because I feel like that's where the range where average draft positions for quarterbacks and tight ends fall nicely into place, where you can get players at a good value there, where if you're picking more at the end of the draft, then it's a point where you're either reaching for a player at either quarterback or tight end, or you're falling and missing an entire tier of players because they're just all drafted at different points of the draft. But 10-team leagues, I find that it's easier to find value all over the place. So 10-team leagues more open to, but 12-team leagues like those early picks.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like for me, I'm kind of the same way. Like I like the early picks, obviously, but I don't mind like the end of drafts, like the 10 to 12 type area, like where you're getting 2 picks in a pretty close range there. And like I know that because of that long stretch of picks coming off the board where we're not getting picks, like I'm somewhat okay reaching a little bit, like just, and I find that I do stick with more like a set strategy, whether it's wide receiver heavy or running back heavy or, things like that. I find that I'm okay to reach a little bit on ADP to make those builds kind of work from those ranges. It's obviously a little bit, it's riskier, but I've been pretty happy with what I've gotten out of that pick range. But yeah, I'm with you for the most part. Like, we want to attack value where it falls, right? And that you could go into a draft with a set strategy planned, but things change all the time. We don't know, everybody's going to be drafting differently. They don't exactly follow ADP. So we just got to be able to kind of, I guess, adjust on the fly, right? And make sure that we're not getting too crazy with reaches, but I don't mind doing it from like the end of the draft range. Okay, let's look at round 2. So we start to get some quarterbacks and tight ends into the mix here. But it starts with 2021's RB1 Jonathan Taylor at 13. At 14, it's Marvin Harrison Jr. 15, it's Kyron Williams. 16, it's Puka Nacua. 17, Devontae Adams. 18, Travis Etienne. 19, Drake London. 20, Derrick Henry. 21, Travis Kelce. 22, Josh Allen. 23, Chris Olave. And 24, Sam Laporta. So Nate, I guess I'll keep asking you kind of what your strategy tends to be here, and like going into the second round, because we still have some real like top 5 overall potential from the players in this round, but then a couple tight ends who we know aren't likely going to finish top 5, top 10, even top 25 overall, what most likely when mixing them in with quarterback, running back, and wide receiver, even in standard PPR scoring. And it's a position that is getting deeper with more relevant fantasy options, especially after last year. So do you have any interest in going after like a Kelce or Laporta here in round 2? Because at the very least, we know they're relatively safe options that we can rely on.
Yeah, typically not going tight end here. I think this is a good example of know what site you're drafting on, because ADP varies a lot depending on different sites, and that's even true at the very top tight ends. Like there are some places where the ADP for Sam Laporta is more at pick 36 than it is 24. And so it really depends on where you're drafting and how players are displayed where you're drafting. So that influences how people are going to pick players. So that influences things. So I generally don't get tight end in round 2, especially because I like some of the value more later on. More okay with it round 3. And then you mentioned like Josh Allen. I can be okay at like picks 23, 24, just if I know I'm going to go quarterback, and I know if I miss on Allen, then I'm not going to be able to get quite the same level of quarterback with my 3rd round pick, where if I miss, I was not get Chris Olave, I can still get a wide receiver in round 3 that's nearly as good. So I'm generally okay getting quarterback there, but for most of the round, I'm just fine getting whichever running back or wide receiver I like the best. A lot of it, I kind of try to figure out my strategy for rounds 3, 4, 5, where I think I'm going to find value there. And then oftentimes I'm okay working my way backwards and making a decision in round 2 because of it, since there are a number of places where I don't find value at running back. So if I'm like, okay, if I'm not going to be able to get a running back in any of these next couple rounds based on who I like in those rounds, then I'll more look towards running backs. Jonathan Taylor at the start of the round there. I like Derrick Henry in the middle there. Kyron Williams, probably worth talking about because he's been in the news over the past 24 hours because it was announced he would be the team's primary punt returner, which at least for me was a little bit concerning. I feels like a lot of people I saw it as a negative thing, and then people overreacted to it being a negative thing because they thought it meant Williams is going to drop all these rounds in the draft, where I'm like, no, I think this just means he's going to get like one or two fewer touches on offense each week, since the Rams all offseason were like, we need to not give Williams this much of a workload every week like we were doing last season so he doesn't get hurt. And now it's like, okay, he's going to get more of his workload as a punt returner, which inherently means that he's probably going to get a little less workload on offense because they want to limit his workload. That's why they added Blake Corum in the draft, and they seem to trust him so far, and they want to get their best players the ball, and that includes getting them the ball on punt returns now, which is not great for fantasy, but it can be good for the Rams, and it allowed them to open up a roster spot for someone else on the roster. So I understand why the Rams are doing it. I don't think it's the end of the world for Williams by any means. They clearly still trust him. They clearly still want to get him the ball. It'll just be slightly less on offense than what it otherwise would have been. So I ended up moving him from the start of the second round to closer to the end of the second round. But I also would not be surprised over the next day or two if his ADP also shifts later in the round. So I could still very well see myself being comfortable drafting Williams just later in the round.
Yeah, I think it makes sense, right? Like, it's at least concerning for Kyren Williams. Like, we don't often see workhorse running backs, also take punt returns or kick returns or anything like that, right? And like you said, just reading the tea leaves all offseason long with them drafting Blake Corum, and then everything that's kind of come out of there, when they've been talking to the media or whatever, whether it's Sean McVay or Kyren Williams himself talking about potentially taking a lighter workload this year, and allowing Blake Corum to give him, rest and things like that. Like, all these kind of signs that point to him not being that, not having that heavy workload that he had last season when he was something over 20 touches per game in terms of carries and targets and everything like that. So we know Corum's going to work in there. I've been worried about Kyren Williams a little bit because of this kind of thing. But yeah, the punt return stuff definitely is just another kind of red flag. So I know he was being drafted as like a top 8 running back. I don't think that's where he necessarily should be either. I'm with you. I moved him behind Travis Etienne, Derrick Henry, those guys that I think I feel a little bit more comfortable in their workload and in their usage. But I still think that Blake Corum will get the majority of the touches, and in leagues where you're getting kick and punt return yardage as well, like that could be very nice. But most leagues don't really have that, so it's just something to kind of keep an eye on there, and it does have me pushing him down a little bit as well. But yeah, I other than that, I mean, I'm not taking tight end in round 2 here either. I feel pretty comfortable waiting until like the 5th or 6th round, whatever it ends up being. Just kind of keep focusing on the upside of the other positions. Maybe I go Josh Allen here, but again, quarterback is one that I tend to wait on a little bit longer in non-super flex drafts, just because of some of the options that are out there at a better value. And we know the quarterback position has a strong floor to bank on as well for the, those of us that do want to wait on the position. But also I kind of like that there are some options that have potential top 5 upside that are going on much later that I'm kind of banking on. So I don't feel that I necessarily have to draft a Josh Allen here, when I could lock on, either Chris Olave or Travis Etienne or Marvin Harrison Jr., Jonathan Taylor potentially as well. So there's, again, I think just better options at running back and wide receiver in this range, more so than targeting quarterback or tight end. Okay, let's go to round 3. No tight ends in this round, though there are a few quarterbacks, but we start with running back Devon Achane of the Miami Dolphins at 25. At 26, it's Brandon Ayuk, currently of the San Francisco 49ers. 27, Josh Jacobs. 28, Isaiah Pacheco. 29, Mike Evans. 30, Patrick Mahomes. 31, Nico Collins. 32, Stephon Diggs. 33, Deebo Samuel. 34, Lamar Jackson. 35, Jalen Hurts. And 36, Jalen Waddle. And Nate, I know, again, I haven't typically gone quarterback or tight end yet. Honestly, I don't know if this is necessarily the round that I'm going to be taking a quarterback yet either, especially if like I have an HN, Pacheco, Waddle on the board. Like, those are 3 players I've ended up with quite a bit in recent drafts. But how about you? How are you looking at a round 3 here?
I am more okay picking quarterbacks in the 3rd round in general. I know, like, you can still get plenty of quarterbacks that you can live with in later rounds, but it's hard to get one that's going to have opportunity to score 25 fantasy points per game on average, since that's a mark that, like, we rarely see hit, but we've seen all of the quarterbacks that we mentioned in this round, Mahomes, Jackson, and Hurts, all have been able to hit that mark before. It's something that like Aaron Rodgers did once in his career, Peyton Manning did once or twice, Brady did once or twice, and then you see a lot of the rushing quarterbacks at their very peak reach that point. But we've seen two of these quarterbacks are more rushing quarterbacks. Jalen Hurts has been like falling down draft boards, but I'm not super concerned about him. I know like the big thing is he lost Jason Kelsey. That'll hurt the tush push and fewer rushing touchdowns. But even if you take away like half of his rushing attempts at the goal line and then take him to a league average in terms of how often he was converting those, he's still one of the top 5 quarterbacks in the league. And we expect him to be a better passer this year, and Kellen Moore's offense and the changes they'll make. I'm really hopeful that Devontae Smith can play in the slot, which is where he's excelled at. So I think this can be a really strong offense this year. And I think Hurts will continue to be a pretty clear top quarterback there. And like Patrick Mahomes, we know the weapons that they have around him now. They've added more deep threats in the receiving game, players who can not just run deep routes, but also catch deep passes, which they haven't had as much in the past. So I think this offense is going to be very good in Kansas City this year. So I understand that. Lamar Jackson, pretty much same as we've seen recently from him. They haven't really changed too much on their offense over the offseason. So I am comfortable getting a quarterback here. Certainly players at other positions that I'm happy with. Jalen Waddle, one of them that I think he can have a really good year. Already by PFF grade, he's one of the best wide receivers in the league, just being overshadowed by Tyreek Hill. But an offense can support 2 fantasy relevant wide receivers. The big thing with them that I will be very interested to see early in the season is Miami likes to rotate their wide receivers a little bit more than most teams. Get Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, a few more plays off. They only kept 4 wide receivers on the roster, so they aren't going to be able to do that currently. Like we could find out by the time this is available for you to listen to that they've added a wide receiver through waivers. That's potentially could happen, but just will be curious to see how that goes there. But this also kind of goes back to what I was saying with not liking the end of round picks, because like quarterback here, if you have the 12th pick, then you just missed out on the top 4 quarterbacks. You weren't going to draft them in round 2 because that's more than a round ADP earlier than you should be, and then they're all gone, and then there's anyone that you want to get now would be a little bit of a reach to get one. So I don't like that flexibility. And similar at tight end, like there was no opportunity to get Sam Laporta or Travis Kelce. You're either getting them a round-ish above their ADP or you can't get them at all. And then a similar thing will happen in 2 rounds from now. So that's partially why I don't like the end of the rounds, because it's hard to get a quarterback and tight end.
Yeah, I hear you. I don't hate like going quarterback here. I guess like for what I've found the most, like especially like you said, depending on where I'm drafting, but I found that a lot of my starts to draft have been kind of wide receiver, just because of the players that are available and not necessarily targeting quarterback or tight end in those first rounds. And what I've ended up kind of doing a lot of the times in the 3rd round is banking on like a Devon Achane or an Isaiah Pacheco as my RB1. Now, Achane, we know obviously, the risk of playing second fiddle to Raheem Mostert, at least in terms of overall touches in Miami. But we also kind of saw the week winning upside from Achane last year as well, right? And, heading into year 2, we're expecting more touches for him, which, even if he isn't going to post that historic, whatever it was, 7.9 yards per carry again, he could still create a lot more value with those touches because of just how explosive he is and his fit in that offense. So I'm feeling pretty good about him, feeling just as good about like Isaiah Pacheco in Kansas City as well, especially with Jerick McKinnon gone and the chance to take even more of that passing down work in an elite offense. Like he was already eating into that work last year, but McKinnon being gone, I think just opens that up a little bit more for Pacheco. I know you wrote him up as a potential league winner as well, and I'm with you. I love his value for him in round 3 or Achane. If either one of those guys are going to be my RB1s heading into the year, I'd be pretty happy with that. But yeah, I still tend to wait on quarterback or tight end. Obviously tight end here, but quarterback mostly I'm still kind of waiting on it. I like a couple more of the other options later. So, if I go really wide receiver heavy, like Jalen Waddle, like you said, one of my favorite targets. in this third round, like wide receiver 12 in 2021. He was wide receiver 8 in 2022 with Tyreek Hill being on the team last year. Last year, obviously, he was hurt, but like you said, this offense can support two potential wide receiver ones. And Waddle was definitely that when he was in the lineup. He had a 27% target rate, which ranks sixth among all wide receivers. His 2.63 yards per route run also tied for sixth at the position. And it just gives him two huge advantages there, compared to some of the other options going ahead of him. And in a pretty good offense as well. And his yards per route run since 2022 with Tyreek Hill joining the team at 2.61 is the third best mark among all wide receivers over that span, behind only Tyreek Hill and Justin Jefferson. So Waddle tends to be another one of my favorite targets here. And like, if I am doing a wide receiver heavy build and he's my wide receiver 3, that makes me feel very happy, for sure. So yeah, that's kind of round 3. Anything else to add for this group?
No, I think I'm good.
Cool. All right. So round 4, we got 5 running backs, 4 wide receivers, 2 tight ends, and 1 QB. So we're starting with DJ Moore at 37. 38 is Rachaad White. 39 is Cooper Kupp. 40 is Michael Pittman Jr. 41 is James Cook. 42 CJ Stroud. 43 DK Metcalf. 44 Malik Neighbors. 45 Mark Andrews. 46 Trey McBride. 47 Joe Mixon, and 48 Alvin Kamara. So this might really be the tight end range for me, but only, if I can't get Malik Neighbors a lot of the time. I just tend to be more drawn to him. But otherwise, I'm really aiming for like a Mark Andrews or a Trey McBride here. But this really isn't a bad group at all. Like I know you don't like Rachaad White as much, Nate. If you're looking at targets and avoids in this round, anyone, I guess, like White kind of stand out to you from this list?
I'll start with the targets, and James Cook and Joe Mixon are the two that I find myself drafting most frequently in this range, just because I think they fit the mold of a RB1, a player that's going to be seeing the vast majority of snaps for the team and a high-scoring offense, a lot of opportunities to score touchdowns. I know the Bills don't always give the ball to the running back on the 1-yard line, but I trust Cook to be on the field the vast majority of the time and getting a lot of touches. We saw that once they switched offensive coordinators last year, he really started to run the ball a lot more. We saw it in the playoffs as well. So I expect his touches to continue to be high like they were last season. And I think in Houston, even with all of the wide receivers they have, I think they want to run the ball a lot. I think the offensive line was a big part of the issue last year, and hopefully they have a bit more stability there last year. I think the running backs are also at least part of the issue, and I think Mixon will help there, and I think he will be able to score a lot of touchdowns. I don't see CJ Stroud doing a lot of 1-yard quarterback sneaks. I think they'll just hand it off to Mixon and score that way, and so I think the volume's going to be there for those 2 running backs. I also like Neighbors, like you said. My thing there is like I like the wide receiver values in other rounds a bit more, where there's a number of wide receivers that I can be more confident that I can pick. So when I'm like following my strategy and have the strategy ahead of time, it's not often getting wide receiver in round 4 because it's either get Neighbors there or have to switch strategies. So I haven't found myself drafting too much of him, even though I do think he is just a good value there in a vacuum. Tight end, depends where I'm picking. I'm generally more okay waiting another round for tight end, but if you think that you're going to miss out on not just these guys, but also the tight ends in the next round, just because it could be a draft where someone starts to run on tight ends and everyone just jumps on. So fine picking either of the tight ends here if that's what ends up happening.
Yeah, this is definitely like the first spot I kind of consider tight end. Like it's definitely the next round as well. Like if I don't, if I do go Malik Neighbors here or James Cook, like you said, I also really like his potential. Joe Mixon. And there was like a quote too, like from, I think it was Joe Brady earlier this offseason saying that they felt more confident in James Cook in those short yardage situations. So maybe, hopefully they give him a little bit more goal line opportunities this year. But yeah, that still remains to be seen. But I'm with you. I still like James Cook quite a bit. But yeah, like if you're just looking like, tight end, for example, I mean, the gap from, at least just in terms of sleeper ADP, like from Kelsey and Laporta to Andrews and McBride from round 2 to round 4, that to me, like if I want early tight end, like that's a value that I want to take advantage of if I can. But yeah, again, Malik Neighbors is somebody that I just have a hard time passing on. If he gets to me, I know the quarterback situation isn't great there, but I still think the potential for targets, like 150 targets, should be within his realm of possibilities, and we know the talent as well. So what he can do with those targets, I think, gives him that kind of upside that we're looking for here. But yeah, it's not a bad range at all. I mean, CJ Stroud, I haven't got, like, outside of Superflex again, like I haven't got a lot of CJ Stroud in this range. It's been still mostly kind of tight end, running back, wide receiver in that fourth round for me. But this next round, the fifth round, I think gets interesting because, like you said, there are some good tight end options here as well. So you don't necessarily have to take one in round four, or if you miss out, you have some options here, but also some interesting players now. Kind of as we get like a greater mix of maybe some potential traps and high upside plays, starting kind of at the top of round five here. At 49, it's Devontae Smith. At 50, it's Kenneth Walker. At 51, it's Dalton Kincaid. 52, Zay Flowers. 53, George Kittle. 54, Tank Dell. 55, Kyle Pitts. 56, Anthony Richardson. 57, George Pickens. 58, Aaron Jones. 59, Amari Cooper. And 60, T. Higgins. So, Nate, a pretty nice mix of options here. There's still some positional top five upside options here potentially for all the positions, but I think it's a bit clearer for kind of the lone quarterback and the tight ends in this range. But how are you feeling about the fifth round? Any clear targets that kind of stand out to you, or even potentially avoids?
This is where I tend to get tight ends, basically. In the majority of my drafts, I end up getting a tight end here because it's nice having three options that I'm decently excited about. All of them have all three of them ranked higher than ADP. Would be comfortable with most of them in the fourth round if that's where their ADP happened to be, but that's typically not where their ADP is. So perfectly happy to get them in the fifth round. Kyle Pitts is the one of the three that I have ranked highest of the group. I think there were a lot of things holding him back last year or the last couple years in Atlanta. First off, we'll say he's still a top 5 tight end by PFF grade over the past 3 seasons, so still grades really well as a receiver, despite some of his cumulative numbers not being as good. Still only 23 years old, will be turning 24 in the season, but he is younger than some of the rookies in this draft class. I know Cade Stover is one of them that is older than Pitts is. But last year, the three big things: he wasn't running enough routes, he wasn't seeing enough targets on shorter passes, and the quarterback play wasn't as good. So he was only running about 25 routes per game over the past 2 seasons. Travis Kelce's more like 35. Tyler Higbee was more at 30 these past 3 seasons with the Rams. And they have the new Rams. Their offensive coordinator came from the Rams. Zach Robinson came from PFF before that. But it already looked like in the preseason, they were basically running the Rams offensive running 11 personnel all the time. So expect his routes to be going up by about 20% from what it was last year. He also had by far the highest average depth of target for tight ends over these past couple of seasons. Using him more as a deeper target, which when you look at all of the targets over 10 plus yards in the air, his numbers are comparable to guys like Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, and George Kittle. But looking at his passes 10 yards or fewer in the air, it's like in the top 25 tight ends from the 20 to 25 range, which is not great. Tyler Higbee's average depth of target was like 4 point something. So I expect a lot more shorter targets for Pitts this year, along with those deeper targets too. But I expect that just to increase his volume in general. Of if you get one catch for PPR, that's an easy point right there, plus however many yards he gets. And then the quarterback situation, the Falcons had the second worst quarterbacks over the past 2 years by PFF passing grade. So this should be a big upgrade with Kirk Cousins. It impacted him more than it impacts most tight ends because of his average depth of target, since the higher the average depth of target, the more the quarterback matters for who's throwing you the ball. So a lot of tight ends, it hasn't really mattered too much who the quarterback is. I think George Kittle is probably a good example of quarterback mattering because he has seen fewer targets because of how much talent San Francisco has. But he's been able to stay a fantasy relevant tight end because Brock Purdy's his quarterback now. So Kittle's getting a lot of those deep passes while still getting some of the shorter ones, but he has a quarterback that can throw him those deep passes now where he did not have that before. So he is getting more yards per play. He's getting more touchdowns because of the quarterback. So he's been able to stay successful without the targets. But I think Pitts will be getting the targets in Atlanta because outside of Drake London, it's like Darnell Mooney at wide receiver. He'll be competing with Ray McLeod for targets in the middle of the field. So I expect a lot more targets, a lot better passes thrown his way. So I'm very confident that Pitts can have a good season this year.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you. I mean, I have Kyle Pitts the highest of this group of tight ends as well. And yeah, I think we talked about it like maybe the tight end rankings episode or whatever. People who are, still upset about drafting Kyle Pitts early, and worrying about the same thing happening. I don't think that's as much of a concern this year because, like you just laid out, the entire situation has really been upgraded for him to succeed, and there's no reason to think that he can't. Again, as long as Kirk Cousins is healthy, right? And, again, the offense itself is going to be more friendly towards his skill set as well, which it just arrows up for Kyle Pitts all over the place. And I'm with you. It's definitely, he's one of the main targets for me in this range. Dalton Kincaid, George Kittle to an extent as well. But Kyle Pitts, definitely my favorite target in this range. But how about, Anthony Richardson, because he's the lone kind of quarterback here. We know what the upside is. We kind of saw it last year in like a small sample size as far as, what he can deliver with his rushing and potentially as a passer as well, just to kind of tack on to his fantasy potential. But it's a lot of kind of like knee-jerk reactions from his preseason game this past week, right? Because the first drive, pretty good. Second drive, not as much, right? But how are you feeling about Anthony Richardson as a potential top 5 quarterback still this year after kind of watching the preseason? Because for me, I still feel fine about him. Like, I think, the preseason, again, they didn't utilize him a lot as a runner, right? So that takes an entire element out of his game, a huge element of his game. But then also, like, when they really leaned into the play action, he was much better, right? I think his splits, like from play action and non-play action, he had like an 80 grade to whatever it was without. I think it was like around 60 or something like that. So there's a big difference there. And we know Shane Steichen also likes to utilize that play action. So I know I feel comfortable with him. I know a lot of people have started to kind of cool on him because of just that small preseason sample. Where are you at with Anthony Richardson after that?
I still think he'll be a top 10 quarterback, but if I want a young rushing quarterback, I'll get Jaden Daniels a couple rounds later than getting Richardson there. Just trying to compare the two situations. And like Daniels was running a lot more in college. He was a higher graded runner in college. So I expect Daniels to be running the ball more than Richardson. Richardson, after his injuries last year, I don't know how much that'll impact his rushing, but even if he was rushing the same amount he was last year, I still expect Daniels to be rushing more, getting more rushing yards. In terms of receivers, a little bit more confident about Washington's receiving room than Indianapolis. It's pretty comparable between the two. They both have a clear number one wide receiver, young options outside of that, running backs that they can throw to. But I think Daniels, his ADP is just much lower. And like he was drafted higher than Richardson was in the NFL draft those 2 years. And there wasn't really enough of Richardson last year. He did score a lot of points in those games, which is why his ADP is so high. He didn't face that great of competition in the games that he played. It just happened to be in his 2 games he was facing not so great defenses that he scored a ton of his fantasy points. So I think that contributes to it some, but I expect Daniels to be able to score a ton on the ground as well. So if I have not gotten a quarterback at this point, I am probably waiting a little bit longer and just getting Jaden Daniels.
Yeah, I mean, I love to wait on Jaden Daniels and for the sleeper ADP, which I think a little bit out of whack as far as where they have Jaden Daniels. I think he's still getting drafted like beyond the top 12 or something like that. I think that's going to come up quite a bit here, especially this weekend. And Jaden Daniels did have a really nice preseason. Like as far as passing goes, like he looked very much the part as that number 2 overall pick. And I'm with you. I've been scooping up a ton of Jaden Daniels. They're one of my favorite players in the drafts. But yeah, I'm still, feeling pretty good about Richardson. It just tends to not be in a range where I'm necessarily looking at quarterbacks. So in, non-super flex leagues, he's not somebody that I've ended up with a ton. This podcast is brought to you by the official sunglasses of PFF Gooder. That's Gooder, Goodr. Are you like me and lose too many pairs of sunglasses? Well, good news. Gooder sunglasses do not slip, slide, or bounce while you're enjoying the end of summer. Whether you're on a run, playing pickleball, or hanging at the beach, you know these sunnies will stick to your head. Even better, their stylish sunnies start at only $25 a pair, have a 1-year warranty, and 30-day free returns. From vibrant colors to classic styles, there's a pair of Gooders for every personality. They even have cool new sunnies dropping right now. Designed for both everyday wear and active individuals that love to run, hike, bike, or more. If you need a new pair of sunnies, Gooder is giving PFF Fantasy listeners free shipping. You can go to gooder.com/PFF Fantasy and use code PFF Fantasy for free shipping. Gooder offers a 30-day money-back guarantee and 100% satisfaction. Again, that's gooder.com/PFF Fantasy and use code PFF Fantasy for free shipping. All right, we're going to try and work through like 10 rounds here. So halfway there, and this is where things get pretty interesting with a few strong and reliable fantasy options of years past. Though this round does start with a quarterback who missed a good amount of time last year in Joe Burrow, but then it goes into DeAndre Swift at 62, 63 James Conner, 64 Keenan Allen, 65 David Montgomery, 66 Christian Kirk, 67 Evan Ingram, 68 Terry McLaurin, 69 Ramondre Stevenson, 70 Rashee Rice, 71 Dak Prescott, 72 Rome Odunze. Nate, this to me isn't necessarily like the very last range to target tight ends or quarterbacks for our starting lineup. We just talked about Jaden Daniels, but if you haven't done so yet, it's at least the range where I think we need to kind of start being like more cognizant of which ones are left on the board, because that pool is starting to dry up a bit. So are you still okay waiting on quarterback, tight end in this range, or is this about the range that you want those positions figured out by now?
Tight end, I'm fine waiting at this point. Evan Ingram, the one guy that we mentioned, and I'm not too high on him this year. I know he did really well to end last year, but that was all when Christian Kirk was out with injury. I think with Kirk back, he will go back down to being a top 10 tight end fantasy still, but I know he did well in that preseason game going up against backup, scoring 2 touchdowns. I do think over time they are going to trust some of the outside wide receivers a little bit more when it comes to scoring touchdowns. Gabe Davis known for scoring touchdowns and everything. So a little bit, there's other tight ends that I'd rather get a little bit later than that. So fine waiting at tight end. Quarterback, I am fine picking one here. Like I said, I'd rather just wait for Jaden Daniels, but I think Joe Burrow at pick 61 here is a decent value for him. Dak Prescott fine with him here. Tend to be looking more at Rashee Rice. It depends where you're drafting, and I think his ADP is going to be all over the place. It has been. I think slowly but surely people have come to realize that he probably isn't going to be suspended this year. If anything, it could happen in 2025. But then I think them signing Juju Smith-Schuster has like cooled things down on him for a bit, but I'm not really concerned about Juju Smith-Schuster. Just the people that I've interacted with on Twitter are. So I'm not sure how that's going to end up impacting his ADP too much, but it is all over the place. I think at underdog in those drafts, he was already going back up in around the 4th round. Perfectly happy to get Rice in round 5. That tends to be where I was getting him before the Juju Smith-Schuster move happened. So if he does fall back into the 6th round, then he's the one that I'm definitely trying to get. Even like when I was doing my perfect draft strategies a week ago, and it used to be tight end was the one thing I was targeting in round 5. I'm like, no, I'm okay getting Rice in round 5 and then figuring everything else out around getting Rice there, because he was just so excellent at the end of the season. He looked like one of those top 10 wide receivers in the NFL. If you look at how he played in any situation, he was finally getting the playing time and putting up the numbers. Even throughout the preseason, we've seen their philosophies change in how they're using their wide receivers. Like we were talking about them weekly last week because of like, okay, this guy's up a little bit, this guy's down a little bit, but it was just, here are the 3 starting wide receivers in the preseason. And that's how they did things. So I think Rice is going to be just fine. They did add wide receivers, but they're deep threat wide receivers. Rice is a shorter average depth of target guy. So I don't think they're competing for the same stuff all that much. So I very happy to get Rice here. And yeah, if I need a quarterback, I'd be fine picking one here. But if Rice is available, I'm not even thinking about it, regardless of even if I already drafted 3 wide receivers, get Rice in, figure things out from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Like he's definitely somebody that I've tried to get a little bit earlier because I do still think that ADP is kind of just on the rise in general. It was down so low because of the suspension news and everything. So he's somebody that I even have like ahead of like Zay Flowers, for example, in round 5. So that does tend to be the range where I would typically include Rashee Rice. But yeah, just looking at this ADP, it's still not necessarily exactly what to reflect his current value considering the suspension situation. Yeah, I love Joe Burrow here. I'd definitely be comfortable with him as my QB1. I do have Kyler Murray ranked 1 spot ahead of him, and he's going in round 7. So, at least in my mind, I'm kind of scooping up some potential value there by waiting one more round for quarterback. It's also a spot where I've ended up with a lot of James Conner. I found, again, like if I'm starting a little bit more wide receiver heavy, and I'm looking for potential starting running backs who I think can, have the talent to kind of carry the workload. And score in a good offense. I think James Conner has been somebody that I've kind of been drawn towards a little bit more as well. So he's been somebody that's ended up as my kind of RB2 a lot of times, potentially my RB1 if I really am fading running back a little bit later.
Yeah, I think running back, I think there's a clear gap after this because we know Stevenson's the starter, we know Connor's the starter, we know Swift is the starter. These are all guys that probably aren't going to be top 10 running backs this year unless there's a lot of injuries and they are the ones that happen to stay healthy. That can happen, but in terms of fantasy points per game, they're going to be starters. You can put them in your starting lineup most of the season, and then you just hope when you're drafting all these running backs in later rounds, hopefully someone ends up being your starter later. But just to fill out your starting lineup, if you don't draft a running back here, then you might not have a running back that you can trust in your starting lineup in the first half of the season or maybe any point of the season.
Yeah, definitely. That's definitely the way we're kind of looking at it here. Okay, round 7. Round 7 to me is kind of gross. This is really where things start to get a little murky for me. Like you said, there is a kind of a tier break as far as the running backs go, and it starts with Najee Harris at 73, but then we got 74 Jaden Reed, 75 Chris Godwin, 76 Xavier Worthy, 77 Tony Pollard, 78 Kyler Murray, 79 Brock Bowers, 80 Jordan Love, 81 Raheem Mostert, 82 Zamir White, 83 Calvin Ridley, and 84 David Njoku. So Nate, kind of a lot of question marks in here between Jaden Reed, who you've covered quite a bit this offseason, Najee Harris, Zamir White, who knows what Brock Bowers will be in that offense in year 1. So this does feel like a round where you kind of have to navigate around some of the potential landmines, or are you willing to bet on some of these more kind of questionable fantasy options for what they could potentially become in 2024, right? Maybe Brock Bowers delivers on that generational tight end upside despite the below average offense. Maybe Najee dominates touches, especially if Jaylen Warren isn't fully healthy. Maybe the Raiders do believe in Zamir White as a bell cow, and the preseason was a red herring. What do you think about this kind of group here?
Yeah, most of these guys I haven't been drafting very much of, especially at the end of the round. It's more guys that we're going to talk about in the 8th round that I'd rather get in the 7th round. Yeah. And in other places do have ADPs in the 7th round. There are a couple of guys in this range that I do like, though. Chris Godwin, I think going back to the slot, being healthy, changing offenses, I generally will trust him there. They've been talking about him playing in the slot all off season. He did play, I think it was just 1 drive in the preseason, but it was almost all in the slot. So excited to see him back there. Xavier Worthy with Kansas City. I know most of the people in Kansas City were excited about, but he was a clear starting wide receiver for them. And I think they're going to throw deep a lot more this year than they have been in the past. So Worthy's someone that I'm happy to take a chance on here. Bowers as well. Fine with him here. There's still another tight end that I'm fine, or at least 2 tight ends that I'm fine waiting a little longer for. But I do think if you want to get Bowers here, I'm perfectly fine with that, though. I do think how they used him in the 1 preseason game showed that he is going to get the playing time needed to be a fantasy starter, just if he can deliver in year 1, especially with the concerns at quarterback. But that's probably the biggest concern, is more so the offense and the quarterback, more so than Bowers himself.
Yeah, that's exactly it. But yeah, for me, I guess I mean I love Kyler Murray here. Like even if I do have to pick him a few spots ahead of ADP, if I'm looking for my QB1, Kyler Murray kind of stands out as somebody that I'm willing to reach for if I need to. I've also still ended up with a fair bit of Tony Pollard as well. Like even though I like Tajay Spears, I've again, if I don't end up with James Conner in the year in the round prior, I end up with Tony Pollard after that. It's one of the two for me, but. Yeah, Xavier Worthy, absolutely. The upside of that offense is also another one that I like quite a bit, and then just the value and upside of kind of like a Raheem Mostert as well. Like last year's RB2, somewhat still likely to lead the backfield in touches, maybe, but going way later than Achan, so almost feels like a necessary value to kind of target as well if you haven't gone running back heavy so far.
Yeah, like usually I find myself getting two running backs before this point, which is why I haven't considered Pollard too much here. But Pollard is someone that if you've only drafted one running back, I am comfortable getting him here.
Yeah, I think so. And that's exactly where I've kind of been getting him. Like if I have two running backs, I'm not taking Tony Pollard, but I'm fine with him if he is going to end up being my RB2, because after that it does get a little bit more dicey. But like you said, I like round 8 a little bit more than I like round 7. And I have a lot of these guys kind of ranked ahead of some of the round 7 guys, but let's go through the names here. So at 85, wide receiver Jordan Addison, 86, tight end Jake Ferguson, 87 Nick Chubb, 88 Lad McConkey, 89 Hollywood Brown, 90 Brock Purdy, 91 Javonte Williams, 92 Zach Moss, 93 Austin Eckler, 94 Keon Coleman, 95 Deontay Johnson, and 96 DeAndre Hopkins. So like I said, this range to me feels slightly better than round 7, at least on Sleeper. I just feel like some of these players, I like some of these players' value and potential wise than some of the guys the round prior. Like for example, I have Jake Ferguson over David Njoku. I have Javonte Williams just ahead of Najee Harris. I got Addison and Deontay Johnson just ahead of Jaden Reed. Lad McConkey, I have just ahead of Xavier Worthy. So this is a range where there's at least a few players I'm somewhat more confident in right now. But how about you?
Yeah, I agree. Jake Ferguson, I also have him above Bowers and Ingram. I know you like Ingram, but
Yeah.
Ferguson, someone with Dallas over the course of his first season as a starter, just kept getting better and better, getting more involved in the offense, especially if you include his playoff performance as well in there. So I think he's someone that you can definitely be happy starting with at tight end, especially if you waited at the position, and the fact that he has fewer competition for targets than he had a year ago. No Michael Gallup, no Tony Pollard to compete with anymore. So that'll be big for him. Deontay Johnson is also someone that I really like in this range. With Carolina, expect him to be the clear number one receiver. Played all 12 snaps with the starters in the preseason, was the only wide receiver to play every snap with the starters. I think I'll see a pretty high target share. I think even if he's not the most productive wide receiver in the world, I think he will see a ton of targets. So the possibility of getting a wide receiver this late who could be top 10 in targets this year, I think is a great value in this range.
Yeah, Deontay Johnson for sure. Like, there's just not a lot of like clear wide receiver ones going at this point and beyond. Like, there might be a couple, but Deontay Johnson definitely stands out. Shout out Beckett as well. I know he just wrote his My Guys article and had Deontay Johnson in there. But yeah, the other guys, like we talked about it a bit last episode, I think it was, but I'm now kind of at the point where I fully believe in Javonte Williams again in 2024. Like, he's only like RB 25 for me in the ranks, but that's just because you don't have to spend much more than that to acquire him in drafts. So, it has to be somewhat reasonable, I guess. But I do believe he at least has potentially top 12 upside, with a real shot for a full-time role in that offense, with Bo Nix at quarterback too, who has that, he was that low A dot king during his time at Oregon and could translate to running back targets as well. Like, I just love the potential here. So he is kind of far and away like one of my favorite targets in this range. And even if he's like my RB2, even a lot of the times he's not, he's usually an RB3 for me. But if I have been kind of hammering really hard at wide receiver and quarterback 1 and tight end 1, by this point, I'm very comfortable with him as an RB2 if I need to, but usually just as a depth option, which is a lot of what these guys are in these next couple rounds as well.
Yeah, and it's worth noting they did cut Samaje Perine yesterday, so he's no longer part of it. I think that'll more lead to Julian McLaughlin getting more snaps on third downs and in passing situations, but that also means that he's not necessarily taking those snaps away from Williams. So I think we can better trust Williams to see a high majority of those first and second down normal opportunities.
Yeah, definitely. All right, round 9. To me, really, this is really kind of the last chance, I think, to get a starting like weekly tight end, unless you plan on streaming the position in season. This is it. Kind of same with quarterback in a way as well, but most drafters will have picked their QB1 or tight end 1 by this point. But if you haven't, to me, now's kind of the last chance to do so. So we're looking at running back Jonathan Brooks at 97, 98, it's Jalen Warren, 99, it's Devin Singletary, 100, it's Jackson Smith and Jigba, 101, Caleb Williams, 102, Dallas Goedert, 103, Christian Watson, 104, Tua Tagovailoa, 105, Brian Thomas Jr., 106, Dalton Schultz, 107, Tajay Spears, 108, Brian Robinson. So Nate, Caleb Williams, Tua Tagovailoa. I'm going to include Jaden Daniels in here as well because I do think his sleeper ADP is going to rise quite a bit this weekend. These to me are the last kind of chance to, I think, get potential top 10, maybe even top 5 upside from the quarterback position. Looking at Jaden Daniels specifically, I think we're beyond that range for tight ends with Goddard and Schultz, but they could at least be solid weekly starters. Are you comfortable waiting this long on those two positions, knowing what the options are that are left, or maybe you're waiting even longer? What do you say here?
Quarterback, as long as I can get Jaden Daniels, but my thing has consistently been in my drafts because I know I'm really high on Daniels, but I'm also like, if I don't get Daniels, then there goes the quarterback position. Yeah. So I've ended up getting him more as a backup quarterback in some leagues early than I have getting him as my starter. So not too comfortable waiting this long for a quarterback. Tight end, the guys that we mentioned in this round, Dallas Goedert, Dalton Schultz, they've both been like tight end 10 to tight end 14 each of these past 2 seasons. So we know what we're getting there. Like, yeah, you can put them in your starting lineup, but you're not going to get a good tight end the entire year. And both teams upgraded their wide receiver 3s this offseason, upgraded their running backs this offseason. So if anything, I expect them to do a little worse than they've been doing these past few years. So definitely want a tight end by now. The one tight end that we're not scheduled to talk about today, but I'm going to bring up if you did wait this long for a tight end is Taysom Hill. I moved him up to my top 12 tight ends recently based on his preseason usage. He's been lining up all over the place, lined up at halfback, fullback, tight end, slot, out wide. And this is in preseason games, and he's been playing 65% of snaps with the starters, and he's never played that high percentage of snaps outside of the games where he was the starting quarterback. But he's never been used in this way as a running back / tight end. And if the Saints are going to be using him even more this year than the past few years, he was a top 12 tight end by fantasy points these past 2 years. Yeah. So there's a chance that he can have top 5 potential in this offense if they keep using him the way that they've been using him in the preseason.
Yeah, that's a good shout out. I did move him up quite a bit as well. Like I was already like relatively high on him compared to the ADP, but he's like tight end 14 for me now, just behind Dalton Schultz. And it's just for that upside, like you said. I want to target that more so at the position than anything else. But yeah, it's an interesting range. Like I know it's more of a gamble on the rookies kind of hitting the ground running if you are waiting this long for QB1, Caleb Williams or Jaden Daniels. But I do, if I am able to pull it off, I do feel more comfortable with them as my QB1 than I do on like a Goddard or a Schultz as my tight end 1. So I'm more likely to wait on QB to this point than tight end. But like I said, you can get one of them, but then I'm almost immediately following it up with another quarterback pick, like whether it's an not Aaron Rodgers necessarily, but like Jared Goff or Kirk Cousins or Trevor Lawrence, somebody like that is a little bit safer and it has a stronger production floor. But I think these guys should have that solid production floor anyways to not kill us, even if they don't necessarily consistently deliver on the upside that we think they might have. Where tight end, I love Goddard as an NFL tight end. I trusted him too much last year for fantasy with mixed results. So I'm not trying to do that again. I would much rather lock up that position a bit earlier if I can. And I'm definitely targeting Taysom Hill as my tight end too, just to make sure I have that upside in the lineup as well. But if I do have both of those positions locked down and I can afford to go, running back or wide receiver here, I kind of like the options. I mean, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Brian Thomas Jr., Tajay Spears, Brian Robinson, like these are all guys that we're drafting for depth, but I think we should be able to plug into starting lineups this year if need be, and not lose much production there, especially if they deliver, on their potential. So yeah, it's not a bad round. I kind of like round 9 here.
Yeah, I'd much rather get quarterback, tight end out of the way because, like you said, these running backs and wide receivers, you're not drafting them to be fantasy starters, but they have that upside opportunity where if they get there, then they can be your fantasy starter, and you're just drafting a number of these guys. So if you get yourself set at quarterback and set at tight end early, then you can draft a lot more running backs, a lot more wide receivers, not have to worry about drafting a backup quarterback, not have to worry about drafting a backup tight end, and just go for that upside.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, one more round here, and it looks like this in round 10. At 109, it is Jared Goff. 110, it is TJ Hawkinson. 111, it's Jameson Williams. 112, Trey Benson. 113, Gus Edwards. 114, Ezekiel Elliott. 115 is Jaden Daniels. 116, Cortland Sutton. 117, Curtis Samuel. 118, Chase Brown. 119, Romeo Doubs. And at 120, it is Blake Corum. So Nate, we're getting into the sleeper territory here now. Again, Jaden Daniels' ADP on sleeper is low, but he tends to get higher in most drafts that I've done. So I'm not seriously including him here, to be honest. TJ Hawkinson also in here, but officially going to start the year on the PUP list and miss at least 4 games, probably more. But anyone in this final round that you kind of have to get here before we really started to get into kind of that free-for-all territory that is, the ADP beyond the top 120?
I think first point, like we've talked about Daniels a ton, he's the clear guy in here, and I think you have to draft him higher than the 10th round on most sites. So he's the one guy there. I do want to mention, you mentioned Hawkinson, and there's been a couple of guys in these past few rounds that we kind of glossed over, but want to mention Nick Chubb and Jonathan Brooks and Hawkinson. They're all guys where like we heard general optimism around them over these past month or so that they could be ready for the start of the season. And all of them starting the season on an injured list should bring their ADPs down a bit, move them all down my rankings after they ended up on the injured list. Yeah. So like they have to be out for these first 3-4 weeks, but then even after that point, they might not be ready. They might not be at 100%. So a lot of these guys I want to avoid. I think the running backs are probably the most interesting thing in this round, and a lot of it just depends on what you've drafted before will determine what you get in this round, because if you need someone who can be a starter in week 1, then like Gus Edwards is probably the clear guy. I'm not sure if Elliott's going to remain this high after the Cowboys added Dalvin Cook earlier today, I think just to the practice squad to start with, but we'll see how that ends up going. But like if you need a running back now, then you're getting one of these veterans who's probably going to be a starter. If you like maybe need a starter earlier rather than later, then Chase Brown could be that guy. We just don't know how things will shake out with Cincinnati, and we'll find out if they bring back Samaje Perine or not, probably within the next 12 hours or so. But there's that. But if you don't need a running back and you're just trying to get a high upside player for later, then it's the rookie running backs in this range, the Trey Benson, Blake Corum that you want to be targeting, because they're probably not going to be fantasy starters unless there's injury to the starter. But if that injury does happen, then you have someone that you're starting over whoever you picked in round 6 or 7 at running back.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. To me, like Blake Corum definitely stands out. He's even been somebody that I've been seeing getting drafted now ahead of Trey Benson, despite, rookie draft capital and stuff like that. But there's definitely a little bit more optimism now around Blake Corum. And it was something we talked about in the handcuffs episode as well, where, if something were to happen to Kyren Williams, then it's a very clear, sizable role that Corum would be taking over and vault his potential into that top 12 range as well, because there's not really another option. I mean, Ronnie Rivers, we'll see. But I mean, again, reading the tea leaves of the offseason, it does seem that he's at least going to work in there with Kyron Williams in the lineup as well. And I think he's definitely somebody worth targeting, even if we're just kind of holding him as a handcuff and kind of seeing how that usage shakes out. But I do like Blake Corum quite a bit. Cortland Sutton is also a name, as far as the wide receivers, we talked about, wide receiver ones not really being available in this range this late, but Cortland Sutton is basically the latest wide receiver one, like clear wide receiver one that you could get. I'm not like including New England necessarily in that, because New England, we don't have a clear option there, but Cortland Sutton in Denver, there's not really anybody that's going to contest him for that number one spot as far as receivers go. So he becomes a very clear value to me as somebody that should just lead this team in receiving production across the board. And it's just such a nice value in round 10 to kind of target for me. So Cortland Sutton definitely has been somebody that I've ended up with quite a bit in this range.
Yeah, he was the clear wide receiver one for Denver in the preseason, but if there was any team where the preseason usage did not matter, It was probably Denver. So I'm not sure how confident I can be about that after Tim Patrick and Little Jordan Humphrey.
Yeah, so
they'll be the wide receiver one.
Yeah, shout out Tim Patrick. But yeah, I mean, it at least gives me hope that Troy Franklin could emerge at some point. But yeah, I feel pretty good about Cortland Sutton at least. Chase Brown also, I think you mentioned him. It's somebody that has been kind of mixing in with the ones there, and Zach Moss out of the backfield in Cincinnati. We know that can be a valuable role, especially if he can start to kind of take over as that RB1. I think Chase Brown makes a lot of sense for somebody looking for running back depth here as a primary target. But anything else to add here, Nate, before we kind of close her out?
I don't think so. Like I mentioned, Taysom Hill is my last tight end that I'm comfortable taking, because after that it just becomes a complete mess. But just at this point, rounds 11, 12, 13, just get a lot of young running backs and wide receivers and hope that they end up working out more so than getting a backup quarterback if you drafted a good one, or backup tight end if you drafted a good one.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, I always find like beyond round 10, like as we really start to get into those later rounds, like I care less about the ADP. Just I want to find the guys that I know have potential upside. I don't want to wait on them and let somebody else grab them. So if you know that there's, a rookie wide receiver, like you said, maybe a Jalen Polk or whoever who you're confident in emerging as like wide receiver one in New England, for example, like that's somebody that I'm willing to reach on, even if the ADP doesn't necessarily say so. Once we get beyond these, into these double digit rounds, anyways. But yeah, other than that, I mean, we've written up the sleeper articles on pff.com. People could find the names that we're interested in. We did a sleeper episode last week as well. But yeah, that's going to do it for our 2024 season preview. I know there are going to be a ton of fantasy drafts happening this weekend, so hopefully that helps you guys get ready. And if you're watching on the YouTube, please don't forget to like and subscribe. We very much appreciate it. And we appreciate you all for listening or watching, however you tuned in. Nate, appreciate you, as always, going through this exercise with me, dropping knowledge on the good folks. So please remind everyone what else you have going on PFF.com to get them ready for the 2024 fantasy football season.
Got my spreadsheet open for this one. So nice. Updated rankings and depth charts after cut down day. Over these next couple of days, it's going to be going through basically all the articles that I wrote over the past 2 months and updating them with up-to-date information to make sure it is all accurate and good and ready for you for your fantasy drafts. Tomorrow will be perfect draft strategy for 10-team leagues, 10 different articles going over each individual pick number, tight end, sleepers, breakout league winners, and rankings. Friday, it's going to be more perfect draft strategy for 12-team leagues by different pick numbers, as well as different size leagues, quarterback information for league winner, breakout, sleepers, and rankings. And Friday, ranking updates for half PPR, standard, and superflex, even though the rankings are always up to date in our ranking section of our website, but in article form, they'll be up to date. Saturday, 12 different perfect draft articles for each of the 12-team leagues. Pick numbers, sleepers, league winners, breakouts, and rankings at running back. Sunday, we get into wide receivers, more ranking updates, kickers, defense, running back handcuffs, the one that we went over. Monday, we'll have bold predictions. That'll be a new article for that day, as well as final perfect draft strategy for 12-team leagues. And then 10 tips to win your league, update to depth charts, 5 players to avoid. And Tuesday, a little bit summary of everything, as well as I'll finally release my guys out of all of this, writing of all these articles over again, picking the guys that I just like the most for this year. And then next week, we're into week one stuff already. I'll have my week one rankings and start sit for week one, and Thursday night recap and Friday night recap next week.
Nice. Yeah. So there you have it, folks. Nathan Jahnke, known slacker. As for me, I've written up my favorite sleepers, favorite IDP sleepers. Version 3.0 of all my rankings and tiers are going to be going up on the site as well, which includes the IDPs on Friday. I'll also be back in the feed Friday morning talking Dark Horse IDPs with the great Adam Markham from the IDP show. And then next week, yeah, it's all about week one, right? Nick Bodiford is going to be joining me for weekly previews. Nate, you're going to be doing the weekly recaps similar to how you've been doing them this preseason, and we'll do the waiver wires together as well. I'll also be doing a brief kind of IDP weekly recap / waiver target show, and then of course the weekly IDP preview shows as well with rotating guests like last year. So whatever you fancy, we should have you covered. It's going to be a great season, so keep it locked here, and until next time, peace out.